Having lost my parents in an accident and grown up in an orphanage, I couldn't find any reason to live or to push forward. Then one day, I received a letter from my mother, who I believed was dead. What's more, the return address was our old family home. This couldn't possibly be happening. But maybe, just maybe. After agonizing for days, I decided to go to the address on the envelope. But as I saw our old home, memories flooding back, I was suddenly overtaken by fear. I decided to peek from the backyard first. I saw a middle-aged couple living there. I squinted for a closer look, thinking if I didn't recognize them, I'd sneak away. But in the next moment, I couldn't believe my eyes.
What? Dad, Mom?
I was dumbstruck by this unexpected turn of events. My name is Katie Anderson. I was placed in an orphanage at the age of 10 and left 2 years ago. I now juggle several part-time jobs and live alone in a cheap apartment in New York City. My parents passed away in a car accident when I was 10. During a holiday trip on the highway, we got involved in a multi-car pileup. I was in the back seat, and by some miracle, I survived. But my parents, in the front seats, were killed on impact when we hit a truck. We were returning from a fun day at the water park, a birthday treat I had longed for. While I was dozing off from exhaustion, I suddenly felt a jolt, as if a cannon had been fired directly into my back. The next moment, I found myself paralyzed and unable to move. In that disorienting moment, I desperately called out for my parents. But with no response, I lost consciousness and woke up in a hospital bed. As soon as the nurses realized I was awake, they started bustling around, and soon after, police officers and doctors flooded into my room. All the while, I kept wondering when my parents would come. I asked the nurses multiple times, "Where are Dad and Mom?" But only got vague answers. At 10, I thought they might be in another hospital. However, a few days later, I understood the evasive responses. My mother's sister told me that my parents' injuries were too severe, and they didn't make it. Furthermore, she said, "I have a family of my own," and told me she couldn't take me in. I just couldn't grasp the situation. My mother's sister explained things to me in simple terms so I could understand. As a result, I understood that since I had lost my parents, I was going to be placed in an orphanage after being discharged from the hospital. I had many questions about what would happen to the house I lived in and what I would do about school, but I remember feeling a slight relief at the thought of not becoming part of a stranger's family. Afterwards, once my injuries healed and I was able to move again, I was sent to an orphanage instead of returning to my own house. My mother's sister had taken care of my parents' funeral and sorted out their belongings while I was hospitalized, and she had also sent my personal items to the facility for me. We had been exchanging letters while I was in the hospital, so I was informed about these arrangements. To be honest, it felt like strangers had rummaged through my house, and I really didn't like it, but there was nothing a 10-year-old like me could do. Moreover, I never even imagined that I wouldn't be able to return home. I wanted to know why, but I didn't know who to ask or how to convey my feelings. Everything moved forward without my input, and I felt like I was just being swept along. That's how my days went. Even after moving to the orphanage, I'd receive letters from my mother's sister a few times a year, but the content was always the same. "How are you? Do you need anything?" At first, I wrote back, but soon I ran out of things to say. So, little by little, I stopped replying to her letters. To begin with, I had never met my mother's sister while my parents were alive, so she felt like a stranger to me. Being worried about by someone I felt was a stranger meant nothing to me, and exchanging letters became a chore. Maybe she sensed how I felt, because the letters from my mother's sister became less and less frequent over the years. By the time I was ready to leave the orphanage, I had almost forgotten about the letters and our relationship had become very distant. I always felt as if I was left behind in some unknown world, spending my days in the orphanage. While I was hospitalized, the funeral took place, and I ended up coming to the facility without ever going back home. Because of that, no matter how much time passed, it all never felt real to me.
Why am I here?
I constantly felt a sense of alienation. As I grew up, this feeling of alienation turned into loneliness.
I have nothing left. There's no point in trying since I have nothing.
Feeling this way, I lost all motivation. So, when I graduated high school and left the facility to get a job, I couldn't fit in with the work environment and the differences with my colleagues, so I quit almost immediately. After that, I hopped from job to job, but I always felt out of place, and none of the jobs lasted long. The time it took to find a new job kept getting longer and longer, and my already limited savings quickly ran out. I managed to scrape by with day labor jobs, living each day on the edge. I often wondered if there was truly any meaning to keep living in such loneliness. Wouldn't it be easier to just leave my apartment and live on the streets? I thought about it many times, but always backed out at the last moment. If my parents knew I was living on the streets, they would surely be devastated. Even though I knew I'd never see them again, I didn't want to make them sad. One exhausting day in that daily grind, I got a call that a letter addressed to me had arrived at the orphanage where I once stayed. Maybe out of guilt for quitting my job shortly after starting, I tried to avoid any association with the facility. So, I planned to have them discard the letter without reading it. But the moment I heard who sent it, I felt as though I'd been hit over the head with a hammer. Incredibly, the letter was from my mother, who I believed had died in an accident when I was 10. I immediately headed to the facility to retrieve the letter. My mind was in turmoil ever since I got the call. My parents were supposed to have died in an accident when I was 10. That's an unchangeable fact. So, miracles don't happen, and there must have been some mistake with the letter. I tried hard to ground myself and not to escape from reality. But against my better judgment, the impossible hope that their deaths might have been a mistake kept cropping up in my mind. If my mother was indeed alive, why had she left me in the facility all these years? What does she hope to achieve by sending a letter now, after all this time? As the train rocked me on my way to the facility, these questions plagued my mind. However, I couldn't find any satisfactory answers or sort out my emotions until the very end. My head was a mess of confusion, joy, doubt, anger, and sadness, and I felt like I could burst into tears at any moment. By the time I arrived at the facility, after a journey of over an hour, my mind was blank from overthinking.
Just see the letter and then decide.
I muttered to myself, trying to reassure myself, before entering the building. When I collected the letter from the office, I stared intently at the handwriting on the envelope. Without a doubt, it was my late mother's handwriting, and the sender was indeed her. With apprehension, I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 letters, each adorned with illustrations of a character I adored when I was 10. The first letter began, "To Katie on her 20th birthday." The soft, somewhat curly handwriting of my mother filled the pages, making my heart ache and my eyes well up just looking at it. The letters overflowed with memories from when I was born until I turned 10, and my mother's hopes and imaginations of how I might grow and change in the next 10 years. It was just so, her. Trying not to get the letters wet from my tears, I looked up at the ceiling over and over. Still, the tears flowed, staining the paper in spots. After reading the letters, I thanked the facility staff and promptly left. My mind was still in turmoil, and I wasn't in a state to talk to anyone. Riding the train home, I reread the letters multiple times. I kept rereading it, feeling that I might grasp something. And eventually, I concluded that these letters were written before the accident. I wrote a letter to my mother on my 10th birthday to show my appreciation. Probably, my mother wrote this letter combining her recollections of my 10th birthday and her hopes for the next decade. The question was, who sent it? The first person I thought of was my mother's sister. However, we hadn't been in touch for years, and I couldn't figure out why she would send a letter in my mother's name. Besides, the return address was our old home from when I was 10. If it was indeed my mother's sister, she'd probably use her own name and address. Considering how out of touch we've been, it feels unlikely she'd even remember me. So, who else could it be? I drew a blank. The motherly warmth in the letter filled me with both happiness and confusion. What should I feel? What should I do after reading this? No matter how much I thought, I couldn't find an answer. Exhausted from pondering, I stashed the letter in a drawer, deciding to act like nothing happened and return to my usual life. But as the days went by, the existence of the letter nagged at me. I thought about throwing it away, but each time I saw my mother's handwriting on the envelope, I just couldn't. Instead, I considered meeting the sender. After all, I didn't have much to begin with, so there wasn't much more to lose. Plus, maybe, just maybe, I could ask them for some assistance in life. Unbeknownst to me, I might have been hoping that the letter's sender had something to change my current life. On the bus headed to a familiar address, I was gazing absent-mindedly at a townscape that looked nothing like my memories. Where there used to be just fields and woods, now stood a large shopping mall and numerous houses. The station I alighted at had a new bus loop, and even a chic cafe.
This is also a world unknown to me.
I pondered as I trudged toward the address written on the letter. But a few minutes later, when I turned a street corner, the sight that greeted me took my breath away. It was a residential area that had barely changed from 10 years ago, just as I remembered it. The view instantly pulled me out of the colorless, hazy world I was in, and transported me back to the vibrant world from a decade ago. This was definitely the town I used to live in. And further down this road was our family home. Before I realized, I found myself running toward the house. I was filled with a peculiar sense of relief, like a school kid returning home or a long-lost child. At the end of my mad dash stood my beloved home, just as I remembered it. Indeed, the letter had been sent from this very place. However, once I got to the front of the house, I couldn't muster the courage to ring the doorbell. The fear of the unknown, of not knowing what would happen next, held me back more than the desire to learn the truth. Pondering on what to do next, I decided to first scout out the backyard. I felt slightly uncomfortable, as if I were a thief, as I discreetly peeked into the garden. And there, on the balcony, I saw a middle-aged couple preparing to sunbathe. The man appeared to be in a wheelchair. To ascertain if I knew them, I continued to observe. Amidst their soft-spoken conversation, for a brief moment, the couple looked in my direction. The instant I saw their faces, I couldn't help but exclaim aloud.
What? Dad, Mom? You're kidding, right?
Frozen in surprise, the man in the wheelchair noticed me. "Katie? Is that you, Katie?" Upon murmuring my name, he suddenly began crying out loud. I, on the other hand, was paralyzed, too overwhelmed by the shocking turn of events. The next moment, the woman, sensing something amiss, rushed out to the balcony in a panic. She ran straight to the man in the wheelchair, trying to comfort him. While sobbing, the man pointed towards me and seemed to be explaining something to the woman. The woman stared intently at me, then suddenly smiled and said, "You're Katie, right? I have something to talk about. Can you come in?" She invited me into her home. Although I couldn't grasp the situation, I had many questions too. I silently nodded and was ushered into the living room from the front door. During the introductions that followed, I learned the woman's name was Irene. And the man in the wheelchair was, as I suspected, my father, Andrew. Furthermore, the two of them were married and apparently lived in this house alone as a couple. According to Irene, my father had been in a severe accident and had been in a critical condition, hovering between life and death. I was told I should have been informed about this when I was 10, but I didn't remember it at all. When I told Irene this, she asked, "How was it explained to you?" I replied that my mother's sister had told me he was in a desperate condition with no hope of survival. But on reflection, it seemed I only heard that my mother had passed away. If that was the case, why had my father been declared dead? Irene helped me reconcile my memories with the truth for hours on end. As a result, I realized I'd made a massive misunderstanding. After the accident, the 10-year-old me, unable to comprehend my father's unconscious state, had felt rejected by him since he never came to see me.
Daddy doesn't come to see me at all. I'm sure he's mad because I said I wanted to go to the water park and that's why Mom died.
At 10, I felt this way and believed my father had grown to hate me. That feeling probably transformed into the memory that both my parents had died in the accident.
I'm just guessing, but I think for the young Katie back then, it was less painful to believe both parents had passed away than to think your father hated you.
Irene said, trying to console me, but honestly, I felt deeply guilty toward my father. Yet, a question arose. I was terrified to ask, but if I didn't, I would regret it forever. Taking a deep breath, I asked Irene,
"Why didn't my father come to get me?"
Irene paused, thinking, and then exchanged glances with my father. Without saying anything, he nodded, and taking that as a cue, Irene began to explain the situation at the time.
Andrew regained consciousness more than half a year after the accident. Half a year.
That coincided with the time I was discharged from the hospital.
Although it was miraculous that he woke up, it took him several more months to fully grasp the situation. Waking up feeling like he had just slept one night, only to realize half a year had passed. It's understandable.
Moreover, my father suffered from post-accident complications, leaving him with many disabilities affecting his memory, speech, and body. The doctors had apparently told him, Returning to your original life is impossible. Initially, my mother's sister, having heard that recovery was hopeless, proceeded with plans to place me in a care facility as scheduled.
When I came to, nothing was left. I painfully realized the length and importance of the time I'd lost while I was out.
My father said that, with a faint glimmer of tears in his eyes. According to Irene, after being discharged, my father went directly to the disability facility where Irene worked.
There were times he wanted to see Katie but couldn't articulate it. At the same time, he began to mentally grasp the death of your mother, Sophia, so for a while, Andrew was deeply depressed and even had to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital.
My father, having lost everything, had once sought meaning in life amidst despair, just like me. Hearing this story, I felt incredibly comforted. My father hadn't disliked or forgotten about me. On the contrary, he cared about me so much that it drove him to mental illness. In that moment, I felt a mysterious warmth, as if the cold loneliness that had settled in my heart was slowly melting away. According to Irene, even after returning from the psychiatric facility, my father's emotional state remained unstable. Not only did he refuse rehabilitation, but he also didn't eat, couldn't convey what he wanted, and often had behavioral issues like lashing out at staff or throwing things. The staff's approach to my father gradually became more mechanical. Amongst all this, the one who always faced him without a hint of annoyance was Irene. To understand what my father wanted to convey, Irene used handmade cards and whiteboards to communicate with him. Moreover, she would find time for massages every day to ensure his muscles didn't stiffen and even came over to practice conversing. My father once told Irene,
"I see traces of Sophia in Irene. I thought Sophia would be saddened by my pitiful state, which made me feel like I had to pull myself together."
As he said this, he tightly gripped Irene's hand. It was palpable just how important Irene had become to my father. Seeing the two of them, I felt a pang of envy. I wished I had someone to support me in the same way. After that, my father, as if reborn, diligently attended rehab every day and stopped lashing out at the staff entirely. When my father first arrived at the facility, he wouldn't even try to get out of bed. But eventually, he began going to the rehab room on his own, even doing exercises voluntarily. It sounded like a miracle just hearing about it. But the real miracle was yet to come. Thanks to his relentless rehab, my father's condition improved to the point where he could lead a normal life. Incredibly, he was able to leave the disability facility.
Even the doctors were amazed, saying they'd never seen such a recovery.
My father said with a hint of pride. Besides my father, Irene was also smiling, looking genuinely happy. Her smile reminded me so much of my late mother that my heart was wrapped in a strange sense of nostalgia and warmth. Speaking of my mother, I hadn't asked about the letter yet. I pulled the letter from my mother out of my bag and inquired about its origin. But my father suddenly looked down and went silent. Seeing this, Irene stepped in and explained why they had sent the letter on his behalf.
"After we got married, I stumbled upon this letter while cleaning up a room. Andrew had always been thinking about you, Katie, but he felt he didn't deserve to see you. I convinced him that, at the very least, he should send this letter."
With Irene's explanation, all the messy pieces in my head finally came together. It was all a twist of fate. Because of the accident and his disability, my father couldn't come to see me. I had mistakenly thought he was dead. Both of us felt lonely and had been walking through a dim life. However, it was this letter left by my mother and Irene that brought my father and me back together.
"I never once forgot about you, Katie. I've always felt guilty for not being there for so long. I thought if I reached out now, it might be a bother. I'm truly sorry."
Saying this, my father deeply bowed his head to me. After hearing about his past struggles, I didn't feel any resentment. In fact, I was genuinely happy to know he had always been thinking about me. Realizing we both had moments of utter despair at the same time made me chuckle and think, like father, like daughter. When I shared this realization with Irene and my father, they both laughed and shed tears. It was the warmest tears I had ever seen. Glancing out the window, I saw the sunset shining on the balcony. I mentioned,
"I think I'm gonna head out now,"
and stood up. But with a panicked voice, my father intervened.
"Wait! We finally met, and I don't want to let you go again, Katie. I know I may not have the right to ask this now, but I want us to be a family again. Please stay."
As he spoke, Tears different from earlier streamed down his face. I was genuinely touched to realize that my father cared so much for me. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the fear that I might ruin the happiness he currently had with Irene. I was torn between wanting to decline the offer and the desire to continue living with my father. I stood there, frozen, unable to answer.
Hey, Katie. Do you think you'd reject me if I was your mom?
What?
I stared deep into Irene's eyes, taken aback by the sudden question. Irene smiled tenderly as if she could see straight into my conflicted heart. Not just her smile, but her generous care and attention were so much like my real mother. It felt as if my real mother was pushing me forward. And in that moment, I found the courage to be true to my feelings. If you'll have me, I'd love to be a part of this family. Shouting my answer, my father's face lit up with joy, almost toppling over from his wheelchair with excitement. Seeing him like that, I laughed heartily for the first time in a decade. I finally felt I had found a place where I belong in the world. Half a year has passed since then. I'm now preparing fervently to pursue my dream of becoming a flight attendant. And next year, I plan to have the interview. Before coming back here, I lacked motivation and had given up thinking about my dreams and my future. However, when I was able to think about my future again after reuniting with my father, my mother's letter guided me once more. The last line of the letter read,
"What are you up to now? Did you become the flight attendant you always dreamed of? No matter what the future holds, know that your mom is cheering you on."
With my mother's loving words in my heart, I decided to chase after my dreams. And I want to spend peaceful days with my father and Irene,